All right, thanks for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz here. Welcome to the program. And my guest is Gregory Whitestone. He's a geologist. He's a best-selling author of Inconvenient Facts, the science that Al Gore doesn't want you to know. Whitestone is a geologist with more than 35 years of experience researching and studying various aspects of the Earth's process. Gregory, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Oh, great to be on with you. Yeah, a lot of crazy stuff going on right now, isn't there?
So for sure. And one of the interesting reports that I've heard come out, and this is also, you allude to this in your press release, is that according to satellite imagery, the actual environment, let's say the air quality of the Earth has improved approximately 30% since the shutdown of the industrialized countries for obvious reasons. We're not, there's less flying, there's less driving, people are inside, there's less mobility from point A to point B, and that the environmentalists are celebrating this in spite of the fact that there's already been tens of thousands of deaths and that this is a dread disease that can hit anyone.
Yeah, there's a lot that you just went over that we can unpack right there. You're right. If we're getting a really good example right now of what life without fossil fuels would be like, aren't we? If you want to get rid of fossil fuels, you can look out your front door, walk down Main Street, and see what it would look like if we stop gasoline, diesel, natural gas, and coal. It'll look a lot like this, I'm pretty sure. The other fascinating thing, I've been exploring this morning, the mortality in both the United States and Europe. I just looked at the European. It's called MOMO, MOMO. Your listener viewers could Google that, and it's showing deaths across Europe are significantly lower than what they have been in the last 5 years. And in spite of this corona outbreak, in the United States, mortality, it's the lowest they've measured in 10 years. So there's far fewer deaths in the United States right now. And that's probably because one of the highest causes of deaths is automobile accidents and things like that.
Right. Yeah.
You're
so
not
we're
going
off
out
the road and there's less.
I just looked at it. It was an hour ago. I mean, this
Sure.
curve is bending way down. So whatever we're doing is really have the unintended consequences of this. What we're doing is saving lots of lives, but we're not engaging in high risk behaviors, which, anytime you get in a car, you've got a risk of an accident.
That's right. Makes sense. Look, I mean, I tend to be, I guess you might say, somewhat green on certain matters. Like, for example, I drive a hybrid for a lot of reasons because I like it, but also the fact is that as a byproduct of that, I think my car emits about 50% less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, carbon monoxide into the atmosphere. And I encourage other people to do that as well. I think that the General Motors actually is working on a hybrid truck, which I think is a good thing. It seems like battery energy is more clean than fossil fuels. But at the same time, I don't want to shut down our industrial growth.
No, I'm going to strongly disagree with you. I don't believe we've talked about this before. I'm a huge proponent of the many benefits of warming combined with increase in carbon dioxide. I view CO2 as a huge benefit to the earth and to humanity. We're growing more crops. There's just so many benefits from increasing carbon dioxide. Because if you look through, I'm a geologist, if you look throughout Earth's history, we're a little over 400 parts per million right now. The average throughout Earth's history was 2,600, 6.5 times what we are. The plants that we rely on, when they first appeared on Earth, it was at 2,500 parts per million. These plants really do much better at high CO2 levels. And in fact, these are called, the flowering plants are called C3 plants. And they again, when they first evolved, that was at about 2,500 parts per million. It was later on that the C4s evolved in response to this lower CO2. Things like corn, maize, sorghum, these are called C4 plants. They do better at low CO2 levels. I mean, they still do better with high CO2, but they just don't they don't get as much bang for the buck, if you will, as most of the other C3 type plants. So if you look at the back of my Ford Escape, I've got a bumper sticker there that says "I heart CO2." I should have, and I was a T-shirt that I sell that I love. Like the "I heart CO2" T-shirts. So no, CO2 should be considered the miracle molecule because of increasing CO2. The slight increases in precipitation, we're seeing things like fires, for example, are in decline. We're being told just the opposite, and we're just it's because
and they're in decline because of an increase in CO2 in the atmosphere.
Well, it's probably due to an increase in soil moisture. The experts at the Canadian Fire Service here in the United States, it's called the National Interagency Fire Center, NIFC. They believe it's due to an increase in soil moisture, and that's a combination of a slight increase in precipitation, because as the oceans warm, they're evaporating more water, which goes into the atmosphere and comes out as rain. That combined with increasing CO2 means that plants don't require as much water because what they do, if you will, they're not, as they breathe in and out, right? They're breathing in CO2, using it in the photosynthesis process, and expelling oxygen, which is a good thing. But as they expel the process of photosynthesis, they're also expelling water vapor out of the plants through the stomata. It's called transpiration. Because they don't need to breathe in, if you will, transpire, breathe in and out as much, they're not losing as much water and then don't require as much. So just think about that. Each plant's just, they're sucking lots of water out of the soil. But one of the problems we see in California, if we look at CAL FIRE data, all things fire related, you go to CAL FIRE. The number of fires in California, get this, has declined by almost 50% in the last 30 years. You would never know it from the media, what the media blows up. Now, the area burned has increased. Okay, so that means that necessarily each fire is probably twice the size and probably a lot more intense. But that's a forest management situation. That's a forest management. We've got the Sierra Nevada Conservancy says that there's somewhere between 4 and 5 times too many trees per acre is what they would like to see. So think about that now, if you will. That's just more fuel for the fire when they go. And we just talked about the water that being sucked out of the soil. So now you got 5 times too many trees, all competing for the same scarce soil moisture. So they're exacerbating any dry conditions that might be there because we've got too many trees.
Right. I've heard this, and that it used to be the case that deadwood was more managed, and also the roads that divide up the forest were cleared better, and that it kept the fires from spreading as quickly. And as you say, the process of photosynthesis, it actually sucks the CO2 out of the atmosphere as part of its process, which in a way lends to a natural regulation of CO2 levels. Now, having said that, while you could argue, and you do argue, that an increase in CO2 is good for plant growth and it's good for a lot of other areas of the earth, at the same time, do we really want to see an overdoing of that? Because it doesn't lead to a healthy breathing atmosphere, and it does lead to, does it not, an increase in the ocean? Isn't it threatening lowlands and shore cities?
Not at all. No. There is. Let's talk first. What do I believe? I'm not a climate science denier. I'm a scientist. I use science, facts, and data. In fact, I've just been recently accepted as an expert reviewer for the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change. Okay, so they've accepted me as that. So what we see, if you go to EPA website, they list for the workplace, what's the level of CO2? And they say, according to the EPA, the minimum or maximum, not the maximum, where they start seeing problems with CO2 is at about 10,000 parts per million. We're at 400 now. We're not expected to even get to 1,000 by the end of this century. We're nowhere near any human complications. And our submariners often get 5, 8, 10,000 parts per million on the submarines with no ill effects. I've had conversations with some of the early versions of the submarines that went from the diesel to the nuclear, and they talk about this. Sometimes their levels got up to 20, 30,000 parts per million. Mm-hmm. And he said, at that level, you start getting a headache and you're not, they'd have to go, but we're nowhere near that. And again, so this is it's what you're talking about here is.
Well, wait. Let me just interject if I might. You make the point that we're nowhere near those levels, but at the same time, that might be number one, because we have made improvements on scrubbing and on atmospheric control. And secondly, with a massive growth, the growth that we want of our industrialization, both in this country and around the world, we could reach that. And the thing is that, while I would be willing to consider, certainly your premise, which is that a higher level of carbon in the atmosphere is a good thing. Nevertheless, there still needs to be some regulation. We don't want to see it reach those kinds of levels.
Well, no one at all is predicting in fact, the reliably unreliable alarmist IPCC, they're projecting at current industrial rates is what we've had. We were going to get to maybe 900 parts per million by the end of this century. There's nobody predicting that we're going to get to thousands of parts per million, because we've gone through, we're at actually dangerously low levels of carbon dioxide. Well, what you've talked about here with sea level rise and all the rest, that's saying that carbon dioxide is accelerating warming, and it's at dangerous levels, and the warming is going to become dangerous, and we're going to lead to all what I call climate apocalypse events. And I agree that increase in CO2 will cause some warming in the atmosphere. I just don't believe it's very large. I think it's modest, and it's greatly overwhelmed by the same natural forces that have been driving temperature since the dawn of time. If we look, we're in a warming trend. It's been warming in fits and starts, but it started in the late 1600s. The first 250 or so years of that warming, of 300 plus years of warming, was entirely naturally driven. It just was. No one's arguing that. But what they'll tell you and your listeners and viewers is that the drivers that have been driving temperature, again, since Earth's beginning, suddenly ceased sometime in the 20th century. And that's not the case. I believe these natural drivers are significant and overwhelm any warming we see from carbon dioxide. So no, there's this increase in CO2. They're targeting CO2 as the demon molecule. That's what we got to stop. And if you do that, if you stop CO2, you stop human progress. You stop industrialization. You look at the Democrat candidates; they're in a race to see who can deindustrialize America the fastest. They really are. They all want to deindustrialize America. That's what you would have to do.
No, and the thing, getting into the politics of this, the thing that troubles me is that even if they're right that you should deindustrialize or at least reduce emissions, they're not talking about China. They're not talking about Brazil. They're not talking about Russia. Tell this to China. You know what I mean? In other words, it reminds me in a way of the anti-nuke movement of the 1980s. They were just talking about reducing America's nukes, not Russia's, not China's, not anyone else's. So it has a political element to it that's, I would argue, anti-American.
Okay, well, if you look at, and I do this, I've got it on my smartphone app, and if your viewers might be interested to know, we've got a smartphone app, and it's a powerful tool that you can use. It's got all the 60 inconvenient facts. You can have this information in the palm of your hand, and it's a powerful tool that you can have. For example, this is Milankovitch cycles. Just search for Inconvenient app or Inconvenient Facts to download. It's really, really impactful. And again, I'm a scientist. I use science, facts, and data to back up what I have to say. And what we
Right.
see,
And Gregory, I also think that there's a lot of evidence to indicate that the so-called establishment, the United Nations, what we used to call the Eastern Seaboard liberal establishment, that they do have a narrative when it comes to global warming, which they've changed the name to climate change since people are looking at, what do you mean global warming? Why am I freezing to death? And that they have shunned scientists and data that would contradict that narrative, which tells me that there is a political agenda here. I just want to see the truth. I mean, I don't want to see, politics played. And the other thing, I mean, in a broad sense, this has made me very much aware of the fact that science itself is a very political side. And people who say, well, someone's anti-science because they don't believe in a particular point of view in science. I would say that it's that those of us who question it are against bad science. We're not anti-science. We
well,
want to see the science.
or they take a kernel of truth and then twist it and use it to their and fit it to what their story is. We talked a little bit about fires. You and your listeners and viewers are being lied to about forest fires here, California, Oregon,
Australia.
Amazon, Australia. We don't need to go into deep, but they're you're being lied to about fires. And I'll tell you another thing I exposed. Back in November, the UN came out with a study on biodiversity, and what they did in that study, you may remember back then they were talking about 1 million species going extinct over the next several decades.
Very alarming, yeah.
Yeah, every time Greta Thunberg opens her mouth, she's talking about the next mass extinction. So I went back and I looked at the UN report, and there's this chart just showing extinction rate just skyrocketing. Well, I went back and looked at the data, and they'd taken the data started in the year 1500, and they added cumulatively 1 century of data onto the other in order to make it look really bad. Well, I went back, and again, they just did 1 data point per century. I went back and looked at the exact same data. If you want to learn about anything related to extinctions or endangered species, there's a place called the IUCN Red List. So you can Google that Red List, and you can get this data, download it for yourself, which is what I did. I went back and looked at it on a decade by decade process, and you can go to my website, which is inconvenientfacts.xyz, and I've got several commentaries I've written on my blog concerning this, and you can see the chart that I created, and you can see that extinctions actually peaked in the late 1800s, and we've been in significant decline ever since. Completely opposite of what the UN concluded in their report. And the thing is, if we're going to get 1 million species to go extinct in the time frame they mentioned, you'd need 25,000 to 30,000 species go extinct per year. You know what it's been for the last 40 years, the average? 2.
Okay, good.
Species going. The big conclusion they should have made in that one was, as humans, we're doing a really, really, really good job conserving and preserving those species that are endangered. We're doing a really good job, and we're getting better every year.
Well, I mean, in some cases, we might be doing too good a job when you forbid a dam project in Tennessee because of the snail darter, and then they find out that there are snail darters all over the place. I mean, it was just, in a way, this is being used as another leverage point to reduce our industrial growth as a nation.
And this is just one example. Again, we talked about fires. We talked about the extinctions. This is how they're twisting the science and trying to promote their own, what I call an why are they doing it? I get asked, is it anti-capitalism? Maybe.
Yes,
Is it control? So. I mean, there's a big, big, big pot of money out there where if they can get a carbon tax, it's going to flow. That money's going to flow into the government, and I don't know what's going to happen to it then. But
it's just, I mean, like when President Trump withdrew from the climate accords, I think he pointed out accurately that all this is a money scam. I mean, we're talking hundreds of billions of American taxpayer dollars going into these shadowy organizations around the world who aren't even doing anything to take a single particle of of carbon out of the atmosphere anyways. All they're doing is fattening their own pockets and furthering their own power. So, I mean, I think that if we want to minimize or at least manage carbon in the atmosphere, and if your premise is correct that there's nothing wrong with it at present levels, then there are reasonable, prudent things that we can do as citizens. I mean, in my case, driving a hybrid, I mean, things like that are reasonable.
Well, but you're not. I don't think you're considering the. If we're looking at you said, oh, I like the batteries. I think they're cleaner. Look, what we're not thinking about is the front end and the back end. The front end, just Google cobalt and Congo and see what you find. You'll find that they're using 8 and 12-year-old boys to mine cobalt for that battery that's in your car, for the things that we need for the solar panels and the wind turbines. And they're doing, or look at the rare earth minerals being mined in Mongolia and China, the devastation, environmental devastation that requires to get the batteries, and for the cell phones, and for the solar panels. And look at the back end. What do we do with all these solar panels and windmills when their 30-year life expectancy is over? They only have a 25 to 30-year lifespan, and now you can. We're going to have these huge amounts of material that have to go in landfills for the wind turbines. You can't put a solar panel in a landfill. It's hazardous waste. So we've got a looming environmental issue coming up here.
Right. Interesting. No, I never really thought of that. I mean, I think that there's a place for solar and wind, but there are also areas where it should not be, like in Boston, for example, where I am.
Why not?
Because there's not enough wind. I mean, there's a big windmill, for example, out on the Southeast Expressway heading south that I used to drive by when I went to a job twice a day, and I rarely did I see it move. It's just not the place. Now, maybe if they did it out in the Cape, and they did it way out in Nantucket Sound, maybe. But of course, that was stopped by Ted Kennedy back in the day because he didn't like the visuals.
I'm not a very big fan of wind energy at all. It's just I'm calling you from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and in Pennsylvania we have what's called the Pennsylvania Game Commission that controls somewhere around 1.8 million acres, mainly for hunting, but it's for the preservation of wildlife. And some of the Game Commission lands are on the tops of these ridges in the eastern. As we come down the Appalachian Mountains, they own these mountain ridges that are prime area for industrial wind turbine developments. They've always have never allowed any projects on their property. And just last year, they voted unanimously. The 8-person commission voted unanimously to permanently ban all wind turbine projects on Pennsylvania Game Commission properties. And that's the Game Commission controls somewhere around 35% of what's been identified as industrial scale wind turbine project development areas. They permanent. They said it goes against our philosophy is to preserve wildlife and preserve especially endangered species. And they made a very strong statement that that doesn't jive with our mission here of preserving animals and preserving endangered species.
Okay, and my guest is Gregory Whitestone. The book is Inconvenient Facts, the Science that Al Gore Doesn't Want You to Know. And Gregory has a very interesting app available, which gets into some alternative views from the establishment with regard to science based upon facts that you then cite from government sources, and others. And it looks like a very worthwhile thing to download, very easy to download right off your Apple, downloader. Gregory, so then what generally you seem to be suggesting here is that fossil fuel energy is the best path forward. Is that right?
Yeah, and we have to do it. I'll tell you my philosophy. I think we should use all of Earth's resources and do it as good stewards. Bam. That's it. Because we can live. We've lifted billions of people already out of generational poverty by providing them affordable, clean, abundant, reliable energy from fossil fuels. coal used to be pretty dirty. But modern electric coal-fired generation, what comes out of that smokestack? Well, it's not smoke, it's steam, which is mostly water vapor and CO2. And again, if CO2 is not, I'm a really big proponent of the many benefits of increasing carbon dioxide. We're actually, if you look through time, if you look over the last 140 million years, there's almost a straight line decline down to what I call the line of death of decreasing CO2. And if we look at it in that context, at the end of the last ice age, we got to a level of about 172 parts per million, dangerously low. And it's dangerous because at 150 parts per million, plant life can't survive. Plant life cannot survive below. So we nearly got to that terribly low limit at the end of the last ice age. And that would have been a true climate apocalypse if plant life can't survive, obviously. Now, beneficial, but thankfully, we've been warming and adding CO2 since that time. And so now, again, we're at about 400, but we're still, and when we look at historically, we're at very, very, very low levels. We actually don't have too much CO2. I'll argue strongly, and I can make a very good case that we're actually CO2 impoverished compared to definitely compared to Earth's history.
Well, I mean, also CO2, we should remember, is natural to the environment. I mean, volcanoes emit more CO2 into the environment. I mean, certainly the big ones than do years of industrial emissions. I mean, I think recently the Pinatubo eruption in the Philippines, I think it was about 10 years ago, Mount St. Helens. These are huge emitters of CO2, and it's a perfectly natural process that actually enriches
that's
the Earth.
That's actually not so.
Okay.
Sorry to correct.
Look, I'm no scientist.
That's a common misconception about volcanoes. I mean, yes, there is CO2 emitted for sure. There have been periods of time when we had lots of volcanoes, but volcanoes are erupting every day around the world. You just don't know about it. And they're emitting about the same. There's a lot of evidence to point that increase of 130 parts per million since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution that's probably man-made, and it's probably due to our burning of fossil fuels. I get that, and I own that. It's not really volcanoes because we've seen we can measure the CO2 level over the last, particularly we use Antarctic ice cores going back 800,000 years. And there's a pretty strong progression. There's a relationship between temperature and CO2, but it's just opposite of what they're being told. Temperature changes and then CO2 changes. In other words, as temperature rise, the oceans start warming up and they start expelling CO2. Warmer temperatures means that the oceans expel CO2 as they cool down during ice ages. It sucks it in. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but if you take a liter jar of ginger ale and open it up and pull it out of your refrigerator, open it up, and it just goes. But put that liter jar of ginger ale on your patio in August in the sun, leave it there for a couple hours and open it up. Man, it's going to be a volcano spewing CO2. It's the CO2 that's degassing out of that ginger ale because the warmer it gets, the more it expels. And the colder it's sucked. So temperature is actually driving CO2 levels through time. It's completely opposite of what we're saying is happening. It's fascinating.
And also, just to conclude here, I mean, now that we're in the middle of the coronavirus, I think that most scientists tell us that warmer climates, warmer, hotter temperatures kill the virus. If you, that's why we're washing our hands with hot water and soap, because the hot water kills the virus along with an antibacterial soap. And that, the general projections are that once the weather starts to get warmer, the virus is going to recede. So where's global warming when we need it?
Yeah, well, I've got a video. If you go to my webpage again, inconvenientfacts.xyz, I've got a video. One of them is global warming saves lives, talking about what you just talked about. If we look at the coronavirus, there's a strong seasonality to the other family of coronaviruses similar to this one, in that it appears in the time frame usually between November and April, and then just disappears completely during the warmer months. So
Right.
that's an optimistic viewpoint. Hopefully the same thing. The most unlikely scenario is that this virus will act differently than its cousins.
Sure.
It'll probably be also display strong seasonality. And we also know that cold weather related deaths, the largest study of its kind, Dr. Antonio Gasparini looked at 74 million temperature related deaths around the world. He found that, and his team found that 20 times as many people die cold related deaths as they do heat related deaths. Again, completely opposite of what we're being told.
Okay. All right, Gregory, let my viewers and listeners know again what your book, where they can get it, your app, and any other information about you that you want to tell us. Oh, okay.
Yeah, the book here, Inconvenient Facts, it's been really a grassroots, people-driven sales of the book. We were just this past weekend, it remained at #1 bestseller in a couple categories. It's been #1 bestseller in several categories since last March, and it's Inconvenient Facts. You can get that. Go search for it on Amazon. Go to my website. The app it's been. People have told me, people I respect say it's the best book available on climate change.
Excellent. All right, Gregory, thanks so much for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.